Rubel, and I'm back with month 8 of the Rainbow Kaleidoscope block of the month. Now, if you've been following along with us, you know that we took our yellow and gray version from last year and recolored it in these fantastic rainbow colors. There's one block for each color, plus black and white in all of them, and then a cool border. So this month is month 8, so we're working on a block using light blue. And here's what my finished block looks like. It's made up of 4 patches, half square triangle units, and a square in a square in the middle. So when you are watching the video for this month's block, in it we'll be making this version of the block, which is exactly the same as our blue and black and white one, just switching out the colors a little bit. If you're not part of the block of the month yet and you'd like to be, head to sitandsewfabrics.com and search for Rainbow Kaleidoscope so that you can grab the kit and join along with us. Each month you'll receive an email with a link to the pattern as well as to the video tutorial, and then you can make this quilt along with us. Hi, I'm Lisa Rubel from Love to Color My World, and today I'm going to walk you through the steps to make block number 8 in the Sunshine and Shadows block of the month quilt from Sit and Sew Fabrics. So this block is right here. It's got a lot of pieces going on in it, but when we break them down, they're pretty easy. We've got half square triangles in the corners. We've got a square in a square in the middle, and a bunch of tiny 4 patches ringing around the center. So we'll make all of the units and then put them together, and you'll see how easy this block can be. Let's get started. So we're going to start out with the center block, and for that we're using a larger yellow square and 2 gray squares for the corners. Our first step is going to be to cut each of those gray squares in half diagonally, so we can add them onto that yellow square. So I'm going to line up my ruler from corner to corner and cut. Okay, so what this is ultimately going to look like is like we've done this. But I'm going to show you some tricks so that your center square goes together as smoothly as possible. So what we're going to do first is to press the center square in half in both directions so we can find the center, and then we can line that up with our triangles. So I'm going to do that. And you can see now I've got just a pressed center point on each of the sides of my squares. I'm going to do the same thing with these triangles, folding them in half and pressing to mark the center of the long side. Now these long edges are on the bias because of cutting that square in half, so they will stretch. So make sure you don't pull at them too much, and then we'll use plenty of pins when we sew so that it doesn't have the opportunity to stretch then. Okay, last one. We're going to sew on 2 of these and then come back and sew the other 2 on. So I'm going to start with the ones on the side. What I'm going to do is match those pressed centers on the side, and then I'm going to pin. And then because I am working with that bias edge, I'm going to put in a couple more pins as well, just to keep everything in place. And I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. And one little check that you can do after you've pinned these in place is that the points that meet in the center, that pressed line should line up between them. Then you know you've got both these triangles centered on your square. So now I'm going to go to the machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down both of these sides to add my first 2 corners. I've got my corners added on, and now I'm going to press them. I'm going to press away from the center square on both sides. There we go. And now what you can do, you don't have to, but what you can do is trim off these little folded corners on the side. It is optional. Your center will go together just fine, even if you don't. So now I'm going to add the triangles to the other two sides. And by getting rid of those corners, what happens is you've got a straight edge to line this up the entire way across, as opposed to going across where these corners would be. So same thing, I'm going to match up my pressed center line on the square on the triangle. And then put in a couple additional pins. Make sure I'm running across that straight edge line, and do the same thing over here. If your pressed center line disappears from when you were pressing out your first two corners, you can always go back and fold it and press it again if you can't see it. And then same thing, I'm going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side, and then we'll press our center unit open. I've got my next two corners added. I'm going to do the same thing and press out from my center square. All right, and now this center unit was designed to be a bit oversized so that we could trim it down and get it to exactly what we needed. We want this to be 6.5 inches square. So if you have a 6.5 inch square ruler, you can put it on top. What you want to make sure is that you have a 1/4 inch past each of those yellow corners. And that way you will have the seam allowance so that everything fits together nicely. So if you do have a 6.5 inch square ruler, up at the top, you want, like I said, to be the 1/4 inch away, and at the bottom, the 1/4 inch away. And on the two sides, the 3 1/4 line should run right through your center points. So here is the center of our block, ready to go. So we're going to set this aside while we work on the 4 patches. And for the 4 patches, you're going to need 16 gray squares and 16 white squares. I'm going to set up one for you, and then we'll be making 8 of those. So we're going to set up 2 white and 2 gray, and if you are using a white on white, make sure that your white is face side up or right side up. So I've got my squares set out with the colors opposite each other. And to sew them together, I'm going to flip both of those over and just sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because we are making so many of these, this is a great opportunity to chain piece, where once you've got the concept down for the first one, as you go to sew the rest, just make gray and white pairs and just sew all of your gray and white squares together in pairs without cutting the thread between each one, and it will be a faster process. And then we can press them and then make them into the 4 patches. But we're going to start out with these little 2 patches, and then I'll show you how to assemble them. So for my 2 patches, I'm going to press them both away from the white fabric so that my seam allowance hides behind that darker fabric. And that works well because when we make a 4 patch, those seam allowances will nest nicely. So I've got my 2 here. I'm gonna set it up again so I've got the colors opposite each other. And I'm just gonna flip one over, match up that center seam, and I put the pin in right behind that seam so that when I'm stitching, I can leave that pin in all the way until I actually pass that stitch line. And that helps the center of my 4 patch to be as perfect as possible. So I'm just going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. So for pressing my 4 patch, I'm just going to press to one side. And here is my cute little unit. we're going to make 8 of these to use in the quilt block. So you can do the same thing I just showed you to make 7 more. And like I said, this is a great time to chain piece, both for putting 2 squares together to make a 2 patch, and then when you join the 2 patches to make the 4. So by now you should have all 8 of your gray and white 4 patches done. And we're going to set those aside while we put together the last units that go into this block, which are half square triangles for the corners, and those are made with gray and yellow squares. So I'm going to start out by drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of my 2 gray squares from one corner to another. And then I'm going to pair each of those marked squares with the yellow square, right sides together. And then for each, I'm going to sew 1/4 inch on each side of that marked line. And then when I cut them apart, we'll have 2 half square triangles. So with each of my stitch squares, where I've got a stitch line on either side of the marked line, I am going to cut them apart on that marked line, which will give me gray and yellow half square triangles. I am going to press them towards the gray fabric for all 4 of these. My square ruler, I'm going to line up the diagonal line on it with the seam line. We're going to start out with this, the square and a square in the center, and I'm going to put the half square triangles in the 4 corners. You'll notice they're all positioned so that the gray is toward the center and the yellow is on the outside. And then it's time to start placing our 4 patches. This is where it's really easy to get them turned the wrong direction. So we will double check after we have them together. But basically what we're trying to do is to create a little gray rectangle in the center on each side. And then also, obviously, that creates a little white rectangle towards the outside as well, which just is a fun design element of this block. So see, very easy to do that because that kind of makes more sense, right? Where it's continuing to alternate. That would give the block a different look. And this is the particular look that we're going for. So just to double check it against the diagram that we've got on the pattern, and you can see I've got my 4 gray rectangles towards the center unit. I've got the gray triangles of my half square triangles pointed in, so we look good to go. So to assemble this block, what I'm going to do is join these 2 4 patches together and these 2 4 patches together, and then we'll sew them, and that will make the center row. So I'm going to flip this over, and because of how we pressed our 4 patches, you end up with nested seams, so that will make it even easier. Put a pin in that one, and a pin in this one, and then stitch both of these sets of 4 patches together. So for my joined 4 patches, I'm going to press them. The direction does not matter because what we're adding them to is not a straight seam, so we don't have to worry about trying to create a situation for nested seams. So if I get these both pressed, then put them back in place, double check that I still have my gray rectangles toward the center, and I do. So now I'm going to fold the first one over and we'll be adding them here. What I'm going to do though is flip it over so that I've got the center unit on top. And that's so that when I go to stitch, I can watch my stitch line and make sure it hits this seam intersection from my yellow square in the right spot, so I keep a point. So I'm going to find that center where those seams intersect and make sure that aligns with the seam the center seam of my 4 patch. I'm going to put a pin in there and then a pin in both ends. Now there's a lot of piecing in these blocks because of those little 4 patches. So it is easy for you to be off just by a tiny bit. What you want to do is match up your ends so that when you get your bigger unit together, it'll be the same size. So you may need to, ease it to fit a little bit as you sew. You can see my end here is a little bit short. So I'm going to line up those raw edges and just ease it as I sew, and then I will be back on track with my stitching. So here's my center row. Looks good, right? So we're going to come over here and press. We're going to press out from the center towards those double 4 patch units that we've added. Oops. Do the same on the other side. And you can see, because I kept the yellow square on top when I sewed, you can see that I've got my points for that yellow square, which is exactly what I wanted. Okay, there we go. So our next step is to sew together the units for the top and the bottom rows. And I've got 4 pieces, so I'm going to sew them together in pairs like this. And then when the pairs are stitched together, then I'll join them to make the whole top row. So I'm going to do that for the top and for the bottom as you go to sew them, and then as you join the pairs together, go back to your pattern and just make sure that, as you sewed them together, they didn't end up in the wrong order or something. So make sure that they match what it looks like in the pattern so that you're set for putting your block together. So here's what my top row looks like, and same thing for the bottom row. So to press these, we're going to press the outer edges from the half square triangles. We're going to press in to the center because that will nest our seams with the center row. And then for the middle seam where the 2 4 patches come together, you can press it in either direction because we're not adding it to a second straight seam. So I'm going to do that for both the top and bottom. And then as soon as we add these rows on, block number 8 will be complete. Then we only have 3 blocks left to finish our block of the month. Okay, so here's what it looks like. One last double check to make sure I've got all of my 4 patches oriented correctly and my corner half square triangles. Looks good. So now I'm going to fold this top row down, and I'm going to start out by flipping it over like I did on the sides and putting that center yellow square corner right on my seam for the 4 patches, and put a pin in there. Then next I'm going to go out to the edges and nest the seams where they meet, and then put 1 more pin in the corner, and then do the same on the other side. Nest the seams and a pin on the corner. So that's my top, and then I'm going to add the bottom in the same way. So here's my block sewn together. Based on the fabric placement, it kind of looks like a ring, doesn't it? With the yellow center and the yellow in the corners. So let's press these last 2 seams, and I'm going to press them away from the center. Get everything to lay nice and flat. This is probably the block in this quilt with the most number of pieces because of those 8 little 4 patches. So once you've got this block done, you've done the hardest block out of our 12. There it is pressed. Let's take a look. So we've got our center square and a square with the yellow with the gray corners, then our 8 4 patches oriented to have these little gray rectangles touching the center, and then our half square triangles in the corner with the yellows pointing out. Looks great. So now we're done with block number 8, and next month we'll be moving on to block number 9. So join me back here and I'll walk you through each step of the block. Hope you're enjoying our sew along. And in the meantime, head over to Sit and Sew Fabrics to check out all of the kits they have to offer. They have a number of pre-cut kits where all of the pieces have already been cut for you, so you can start sewing right away, as well as kits made with yardage like the Fat Quarter Bundle for this particular project. And make sure to follow Sit and Sew Fabrics on Instagram, Sit and Sew Fabrics, as well as on Facebook. See you next month.